Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us at the BU CTSI Community Engagement Program, Building a Culture of Community Engagement speaker series. This is our first session of the year. We're really excited to have you all back with us. And for the first session of the year, we have our two CE program co-directors, Tracy Battaglia, who's also associate professor at the BU School of Medicine. And we have Linda Sprague Martinez, who's also the associate professor at the BU School of Social Work. And we're going to really focus on shifting power to community. What does it take? And we're going to hear insight and experiences from these two community engaged researchers. So with that, I will pass it over to Linda and Tracy.
Great. Thank you so much, Dima. We're excited to be here with you all this evening. I'm going to start and just welcome you to the speaker series, give you a little bit of a preview of what's to come this year, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and partner in crime, Tracy Battaglia, who will get us started talking about clinical translational science. So with that, you can click to the next slide. So new year, new name, new format. We are really excited. This is our third year with a speaker series. And now we're really thinking, we piloted in year one. We had a speaker series last year along with a networking session last year. And this year we're really thinking about building a culture of community engagement with this speaker series. And so we've combined our formats to offer the topic-based moderated discussion, but with opportunities to network afterwards. And so we'll welcome everyone to stay with us after the discussion to go into some lightning round conversations, to meet some colleagues from across schools so that we can really start to build a culture of engagement together. Some of the topics that you're going to see this year, and you can obviously go to our website to check them out as well, but you'll hear about community engagement and anti-racist research, engagement to advance equity, behavioral health and community engagement. We also will hear from some partnership research scholars this year. So we're really excited to get chatting, to get networking, and to get to creating a culture of engagement. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tracy Battaglia, who is a co-director of Community Engagement Program for the CTSI, has been for many years, and is really going to just talk to us a little bit about CTSI and translation and get us started with this conversation.
Thank you, Linda. Good evening, everyone. It's really great to see many familiar faces and some new ones. It's also exciting to kick off the academic year with this new speaker series. So thrilled to be doing it with my colleague, Linda. This is meant to be an interactive session. And so we're going to lay some foundational sort of concepts for all of you. And then we're going to have kind of just like a dialogue between Linda and I on some sort of general domains and approaches that our community engagement program is trying to doing to address some of the barriers to translational science. So for those of you who are not familiar with the CTSI sort of mechanism, CTSI stands for Clinical Translational Science Institute. Sometimes we refer to them as CTSAs, Clinical Translational Science, help me, Clinical Translational Science Awards. Thank you. And they are funded through NIH, the National Institutes of Health, through the agency called NCATS, the National Center to Advance Translational Science. And the focus of NCATS and the reason NCATS exists is because there is a strong belief that optimal health requires translation of scientific discoveries into programs and policies that improve the health of all populations. And the notion that there are tremendous barriers to translational science is the reason why CTSA programs exist. So I'm going to walk us through a little bit of the language of translation, because we feel really strongly that it's important for all of our colleagues to understand why we do what we do and in the pursuit of optimal health for our communities. So translation is the process, as I said, of turning observations from the laboratory and clinic and community into interventions, policies, and programs that improve health. And NCATS makes a big distinction between translational research and translational science. And it's not intuitive, and we're all trying to get our heads around the difference between translational research and translational science because it's really an evolving field. Translational research is really about traversing a particular step of the translational process for a particular disease or target. So for example, breast cancer care delivery. If there's a barrier to getting optimal care to breast cancer patients, that's a translational research question. Translational science is sort of steps back a little bit and looks at the field of translation to try to understand common barriers that are present in all disease sites and coming up with solutions and testing solutions to traverse those barriers for any disease site. And so that's the spirit of sort of what the CTSI programs are meant to address. The next slide is just a figure from NCATS that sort of puts this sort of into a figure. Some of us are visual learners. You can see that at the center is the patient, and then you have basic science, preclinical research, research that happens in clinical settings, and then implementing evidence-based practices in clinical settings and sort of public health. And the outside layer of this very complex system is the need for an iterative process of developing new approaches and demonstrating their usefulness and disseminating those findings. And that's what the CTSA programs aspire to do. The next slide highlights some examples of the many barriers to translational science. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I'll just summarize that they range from, workforce development issues of having a diverse workforce to do this work, to not having the right technology or data systems to study certain populations. What we did here is highlight in purple 4 translational barriers that relate to health equity and community engagement work. And we're going to focus on talking about some approaches to overcoming these barriers in our conversation today to really shift the culture, which is the focus of our speaker series. The first is around the fact that our systems are set up to be incentivized by our individually focused incentives. That's what sort of, makes our academic systems work. The second one is, homogeneity of our research teams and our research leadership and not having diverse perspectives at the table. The next one is the absence of patients and communities equitably partnering with us in the conduct of this translational science. And then there's just inefficient operational systems within our systems that lead to delays. So I hope that sort of provides a little bit of a foundation for the rest of our conversation. I'm going to hand it off to Linda so she could sort of further walk us through our focus on really the organizational barriers to this work.
Great, thanks, Tracy. And so thinking about community engagement, we're the community engagement program. We're really interested in broad participation of communities, partnerships and partnering with communities. And when we think about community engagement, every CTSA has a community engagement program because it is a strategy. It's been identified as a strategy to facilitate translation. It's also an approach to research. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we create a culture that really allows for it? And the more and more we think about that, if you click again, we start to realize that it's really problematic that we need community engagement, right? If you think about that, why is it that we would need to have community engagement? It speaks to all of the inequities in terms of the fact that people are unable to participate and are not part of our systems, and that our systems are siloed and separate from our communities. You can click to the next slide. And for us, we were really thinking, well, we started to think about, well, how do we get there? How do we get here? And then where are we going? How is it that there is such of what's been referred to in the literature as a town-gown divide, that we sit within what's often referred to as an ivory tower, or conducting research that's so separate from our communities and so irrelevant for our communities. And so as Tracy spoke to, a lot of that is the result of our structures. And so if you click to the next slide. and the way we approach things. And so dominant ideological messages that we receive reflect the interests of a dominant class in society, and that knowledge is not neutral, and it's the product of specific historical moments, and reflects the ideas and belief of definite groups in society. So when we think about ideology and the messages that we receive, if you click to the next slide, if we think about the dominant ideological messages that we receive and that we work, that guide our practices and shape our organizations and institutions and this country, it's really capitalism is drives a lot of our dominant ideology, individualism, competition, self-interest. And so when we look at our incentive structures, as Tracy noted, a lot of that's all about individual incentives, which sets us up for systems of competition and not collaborative work. And so those are embedded within the policies. They're the unspoken norms and rules. And if you click to the next slide, a little bit more. And so the political economy, you clicked so soon and ruined my surprise. So that's all right. That's all right. You gave it away. So when I asked the question, everyone will get it right. But the political economy, it was dependent on the construction of race. We know that, right? And a racial hierarchy in particular. And that really is fueled by an ideology of white supremacy. So all these things are intertwined, right? And every sector in our society has pitched in, lended a hand in reproducing white supremacy early on and over the years to ensure that it remains in its status as a dominant narrative. And so the media, education, medicine, science, the arts have all contributed to fueling that dominant narrative. Capitalism needed it. So that's why oftentimes it's referred to, when we talk about capitalism in the US, we talk about, and globally, we talk about racial capitalism. Because they are so intertwined. And so a lot of times you hear people, you can click to the next slide now, talk about our system is broken. In fact, the system is not broken. The system is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. And so that's the hard part, right? It works for who it was designed to work for. And in our, like, I'll speak specific to US because that's where we are right now, is that our system wasn't designed to work for everyone. And so the same folks who are unable to access our systems and where we see the inequities, the system wasn't designed to work for them. So it doesn't. And so that means the hard task we have is to really rethink our system. So if you click to the next slide, but sometimes we don't see it, right? So how is it that this is happening? We don't see it. And this is a great image from Dismantling Racism. But the longer that you swim in a culture, or the longer you're part of a system, the more it becomes invisible to us. And so unless we're really explicit, we're really thinking, we're really paying attention, we're not going to be looking at all of the ways in which the structure and the culture is embedded that really fuels it. And particularly if it's not impacting us directly, right? If it's not impacting us directly, we're not likely to see it. And sometimes when it is impacting us directly, we don't see it because we internalize that system. So if you click to the next image. And so as Robert Livingston says, is like the real challenge for us as organizations is not figuring out what we can do, but rather, are we willing to do it? Because there's some risk involved, right? If we start to think about changing our system so that it works for more folks, really rethinking our structures, our incentives, all of those things take work, and sometimes they work against some people, right? So if you're winning now, you might not be winning as much. So those are the trade-offs to really beginning for us beginning to think about how do we change our culture so that we have a culture of engagement, so that this is just the way we operate. You know, ideally at one point we won't need a community engagement program. I'm in the School of Social Work. I like to think that one day we won't need social workers, right? We have policies that work for everyone. So let's click to the next slide. And so how do we move forward? So part of that, we need to think about changing the way we do business. We need to see each other. We need to center relationships. And we might think, oh, we do that now, but our system really drives competition, right? It's if I think about, getting grants, being a sole PI versus a multi-PI, how are we going to share indirects? Wait, am I going to get credit for that? All of these questions we sometimes have to ask ourselves, all of the things that stop us from collaborating. Wait, if I introduce you to my community partner, does that mean I can't work with them too? Well, that's my, the whole idea that that's my community partner, not yours. The reality, and when we're all here in Boston, in the city, trying to improve health. So we really have to think about how we interact with one another, and we have to be radically collaborative. It's not enough to be just collaborative. We really need to engage, we need to share, and we need to be vulnerable in order to do that. And we thinking about how do we center the we and the us as opposed to the I and the me. And that's hard because every single message we get is about becoming the expert in our field, centering our work, So I think those are some of the challenges that we face. With that, I'm gonna turn it back over to Tracy to share some experiments that we've been thinking about.
Excellent. Thanks, Linda. All right, so this is our last slide before we take the slides down and engage in dialogue with you. So to warm you up, I'm going to ask you to do an emoji for me and tell me with a thumbs up or a heart or whatever, is anyone familiar with the Trojan mouse? Because my colleague Linda taught me about the Trojan mouse recently. Give me a thumbs up or a heart. I have to move my arrow here to see if I see anybody. Thumbs up or a heart. Nobody knows about the Trojan mouse? All right, Linda, I got one from Linda and one from Rebecca. Okay, good. So I'm going to teach you what I just learned, which is that the Trojan mouse sort of represents the notion of incremental change, and counter to the Trojan horse, which is about winning a war, the Trojan mouse is about winning battles. And that small incremental change is necessary to change culture. And that's really sort of the heart of the sort of conversation that we want to have with you this evening around, in order to shift culture, we need to be doing iterative small change to switch sort of and get to where we want to be with community-driven research. And so what Linda and I did with the help of our CE team, Rebecca, Dima, and Jen, was to really think about these 4 domains and themes that are sort of areas where organizational leaders and researchers and community members like yourselves can create change and can begin to shift the culture. And we're going to share with you some examples in these domains of work that we are doing to try to get there. And then we would encourage you to engage with us and share things that you may be doing along these different areas. And so we welcome you to interact with us in the chat. You can raise your hand, interrupt us, take yourself off mute. We want this to be an interactive session. But let me run through the 4 areas, and then I'll ask Dima to throw them in the chat, and we can put the slides down. So the first one is really around, and these are like intentional experimental changes to really change culture. The first is about rethinking our funding structures and how we allocate resources and what we invest in. There's no sort of secret that NIH, for example, does not fund partnership development. And so if we're really going to do community engaged science and promote community academic partnerships, we need to invest in them. But the current NIH funding structure doesn't do that. The second area is about being deliberate in our programming, coaching, and consulting. And so I've been in academics for over 20 years, and it wasn't until COVID and George Floyd that we started having intentional conversations about health equity. And our programming and our coaching started to really focus on health equity. And so it needs to be deliberate and intentional. The third area is about revisiting procedures and systems. We have to look and understand how existing systems marginalize certain populations, whether it be in our finance systems, in our IRB systems. I can recall, and I've shared with others in the past, we had a project with a community partner, a very small community-based organization, and we went to sort of provide their subcontract payment. They had to fill out a form, and the form at the top of the form said high-risk contract. Because of federal regulations about the size of this community, they were considered a high-risk contract. And that's all sort of, policies and procedures that are in place that are harmful to our partners. That created a lot of mistrust in our relationship. And so it's being really thoughtful, intentional about these procedures and systems. And then the final one is attending to organizational design and structure, and really sort of putting structures and changing the organization to allow all of the things that we just talked about. So Dima, if you can throw those in the chat and we can take the slide down. I'm going to kick us off with the first one and provide an example of some of the small experiments and the work that we've been doing within our CE program around funding structures and allocating resources. So we just launched in the fall our new partnership scholar grants. Is that what they're called? Partnership scholar, help me. I have it right. Partnership scholar grants. So we've been talking about this for about, I don't know, 10 years in the CTSI. How can we create and provide funding to support community academic partnerships? I think the only other organization that I'm aware of that funds this is PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And we struggled to do that because the funding that we get from NCATS is NIH funding and does not allow to invest in pilot grants that support relationships. They have to be around science. And so we got creative and we were able to get investment from the institution, the hospital, and the medical and the university to support our inaugural group of partnership research scholars that brings together research partners and a community partner and shares resources equally. So the budget goes half and half, and the work that is done with those resources is to really develop the relationship so they can co-create a research agenda together. Another example of a project we recently participated in, and I'm looking at my colleague, Dr. Fisher, who's with us tonight. We had the opportunity to work with our health centers on an application for a research study around hypertension. And in that process, with our partners, we did what's called a participatory budgetary process, where we said to our partners, here's what role we see for you in the project. You tell us what resources you need and you develop your budget, as opposed to us telling them you have X amount of dollars to do this work, allocate your resources accordingly. So those are two examples of, what we're trying to sort of do on our end to address this issue of funding structures and allocating resources. So Linda, I don't know if you have anything to add to those examples or any examples of your own.
No, I think those are great examples. I think that the challenge is always that what's funded is around the outcomes, and we assume that the relationship will come along, but if we're going to co-create, we need to be able to do that. There have been only a few. We had an opportunity when there was, back a little while ago now, 2008, the stimulus grants when they were out. If anyone remembers, that was around in 2008. I received a grant with partners from a bunch of different organizations to develop an intervention for health equity. And for those, and it was like a special grant, we had the opportunity to write a grant to NIH, which was different. And it was challenging through the review process because they wanted you to develop it with your, develop an intervention with partners, but you couldn't, but the reviewers were expecting a grant with outcome. A grant with outcomes. And so we don't pay attention to process. And so I think with the partners grant and similar to with this opportunity, was really focused on working together to put together the process. And so that's important because, it's highlighting and the fact that it's not just about the outcomes, right? And when you look at the literature on white supremacy culture and how that plays out in organizations, it's all about outcomes driven, not process, and so we really, by redirecting and focusing in on the process, we're able to really kind of begin to create a cultural shift. And the challenge is not to get wrapped up in the loop of how are we demonstrating our value of that, right? That's the challenge. And then the other, I don't know if we want to jump down to the next one around.
Yeah, we can. I just want to acknowledge that two of our partnership scholars are in the audience, Keiko and Margaret. If you want to just do a little hello with an emoji or a wave. Thank you for joining us. There's Keiko. Hi, Keiko. And so no pressure on you guys, but you're our inaugural research scholar team. And so your wonderful successes are going to lead the way to continued investment in this kind of a project. So thank you for your leadership.
No pressure at all there, right?
But because we are being radically collaborative, Keiko, we will be with you throughout the process.
That's right. And that is a nice segue to addressing the second area of deliberate programming coaching. And so we are not just providing resources to our research scholars and their community partners, but we're providing a forum, an intentional and deliberate program to coach and support them through this relationship development process to improve their likelihood of being successful. So Linda, I don't know if you want to speak to what the learning collaborative that this group is going to be participating in that we're just launching.
Yeah, I think the goal is really that we want to create community, right? There's so much, there's such great work. The scholars that have applied to this mechanism have, really exciting and innovative approaches to partnership and ideas around science. And so our goal is really to bring folks together to create the space, right? Being intentional about building the structure. Those are, when you think about different cultural embedding practices, we want to be intentional about creating those structures, and so space and time to come together to work on partnerships, being in relationship with each other, with us being in relationship as a broader group of community engaged researchers and scholars, to really come together and learn and to build relationships that will advance health and health equity. So that's we're excited about that. We have a 3-part learning collaborative that will happen over the course of this year to support one another in putting together the grants, collecting data, disseminating, and so we're very excited about that work. So
yeah, and this this speaker series is also an intentional and deliberate program to sort of create a space to have these conversations and to share best practices and challenges, because this work is not easy. I think one of the things that we continue to pay attention to intentionally in our program is how to engage leadership. And so Dr. Fisher is one of our sort of leaders in general internal medicine. We appreciate your presence because we don't have enough of sort of leadership at the table during these discussions. We often have junior faculty and staff and community members who are participating in these conversations, and not as much of people sort of in the who have sort of decision-making power about changing some of these structures. And so if folks have ideas about how we make intentional programming and deliberate programming that will attract those groups, we'd be very open to hearing about it. Okay, so we should probably move on to the third one, which is revisiting procedures and systems developed, revisiting procedures and systems, and specifically thinking about how do you create systems that are co-created or developed with our community partners and are not designed by the ivory tower without input from our community partners. So for this, I'm going to highlight the Boston Health Net Research Collaborative. I don't know if any of my Boston Health Net colleagues are on. I don't see them. But huge shout out to Leslie Carver, Bill Adams, and Charlie Williams from Boston Health Net, who have been really passionate about partnering with us on research. They truly believe, as representatives of our community health center partners, that to optimize the health of their populations, research is really important. And so we've been, we've had some small wins over the years in terms of creating procedures that support the community health centers. For example, many years ago, when I first came to the institution, we worked with the IRB to put a stopgap, essentially, to make sure research wasn't happening in health centers without the health centers knowing about it. Believe it or not, that was the norm back in the day. And so we created a system, and any of you who've done research with the health centers may be aware of this. In order to get your IRB approved or complete your IRB application, you have to have a signed approval from your health center leadership team in order to sort of include them as a site in your program. And so that was many years ago. And over the years, we've worked together to figure out, well, how do we create a system that is really supports the priorities of the health centers to allow them to be partners with our academic researchers. And so over the course of about a year and support from the Health Equity Accelerator, we developed what we call now the Boston Health Net Research Collaborative, which is a group of research liaisons from 8 of our affiliated community health centers who convene regularly. Together, they designed sort of rules of engagement, like if you want to partner with us at these health centers, here's the rules of engagement of doing so. In addition to that, they created bios of their health centers so that investigators can sort of look to see the patient population and their sort of priority health areas and some resources that they have available to sort of help with the matching process. And then they created an actual process, which includes an online sort of application process to for researchers to go and apply to partner. And we launched that in January of this year. I think we had at our last review about 19 applications go through that process. It's not working perfectly. And I think in our last meeting, we talked about the fact that this process is necessary but not sufficient. And I'm glad Dr. Fisher's still with us because he and I embarked on this PCORI application over the summer and used the process. And we said, we're looking for partners, as many partners as possible to work with us on hypertension, which we know is a health priority for HealthNet. And that process wasn't all that lucrative in terms of finding partners. We had to engage in a lot of phone calls, conversations, open office hours. We had a lot of support from Bill and Charlie in sort of, getting us in front of the health center leadership in order for them to decide whether or not this was something of interest to them. And ultimately, Mike, we had how many health centers join us? 4 or 3? 4?
I believe 4. 4, I think.
And it was a really great process. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to sort of put systems into place that really support this kind of work. Belinda, I don't know if you have anything to add, or Mike, if you have anything to add about the experience and, what kinds of systems are needed for this work to really, be effective, given, how tight the timeline was in, getting these partners and getting the application in on time.
Yeah, I mean, there were, excuse me, there were a couple of unusual things about that particular opportunity that had a very tight sort of turnaround time that made it more stressful, that they did it over the, smack dab in the middle of summer because I think because they hate researchers, presumably. So that it would ruin, we'd be asking people to take on this extra work in the middle of when they're trying to spend time with their families. So that wasn't ideal, but I think that was sort of more of a one-off. So I don't think usually it's that under the gun, but it is, I think for researchers, it really does mean a willingness to build more time into the process. The discussions take time, and I'll say that one of the things that helped us for the summer is actually the BHM process, and I give a ton of credit. I think Dima helped orient to it, and Charlie and Bill and others, and all of you who sort of set it up over the past year. I've actually used it a couple of times earlier in the year for projects, some of which didn't launch, but we had conversations, and you do have to be willing to sort of take no for an answer and keep engaging to find the right thing. And I think the more we can create that communication, the more there'll be opportunities that it becomes normalized, and we can flow, we as the research community can float, sort of run ideas by the research liaisons at all of our partner health centers early in the process and get their feedback, and they have an early chance to say, are they interested or not? And it's okay if they say no. And it can be more bi-directional. We can have more of a running list of what is of interest to the centers. And are there those of us on sort of the research side of the partnerships who, who can be alert when an opportunity comes along that we know, oh, this is of real interest to 2 or 3 or 4 more of the centers, and we can really be ready to jump right in.
I think building on, Mike, your point about relationships and really taking the time to reach out, create those bi-directional conversations, that's so critical. Early on when we first launched the speaker series, that was one of our goals in working with financial systems and IRBs, is just to reach out and to start having conversations about community engagement and community engaged research and why it looks different and why some of these practices, as Tracy was describing, such as risk assessment, get in the way of our ability to partner, and why is it so hard for us to get contracts through to community partners, and the challenges with lack of infrastructure that our system doesn't take into account, right? We assume that all other systems must operate the way we operate, or they're not worth our working with, or they're not valuable, or they're not strong enough, or they're a risk, right? And so I think those ongoing conversations with IRB, with finance, are really critical in helping to move these things along, and to begin to build relationships so that we can start to kind of break down some of the barriers and just learn, right? So I have to learn from my colleagues in finance, and I'm thinking of when we were able to work with Shelley from the finance department, and we worked with we had a meeting also with some of the finance folks from BMC, but it was really important for me as a researcher to understand the barriers that they're up against as finance. So understanding our structures, and that they're in place, because a lot of times as researchers, we didn't get trained, my PhD program, we didn't train in financial structures and risk assessment, but I need to know how all those systems operate so that when I'm having conversations and engaging with my partners in the community and we're thinking about what we want to do, then we know exactly up front what's going to be needed so that later on I'm not running back. I had that experience recently of understanding what do we need in order to get this individual paid in a timely fashion. So I do think that the structures and being really intentional about them, that's our responsibility as well as partners and good stewards to be able to understand our own structures and how they operate. So I think another key piece there.
That's a great example. All right, I think that the 4th domain was related to attending to organizational design and structures, which is a little different than the procedures and systems. And really this is about creating organizational change such that there are diverse perspectives at the table. And Keiku's raising his hand, so I'm going to let him ask a question.
Thank you, and thanks for the perspectives. On the structures piece, is part of our role also looking out for structures that maybe at some point served a purpose, but now may be antiquated and need to change? And is this another piece that we add on to our already overflowing plates? Or is there somewhere we can go in the institution saying, hey, look out for this thing, there's a disconnect here. And then let somebody else handle it.
Excellent question. I mean, my immediate sort of reaction to that question is it's our collective responsibility. And, that's why we're hopeful that these forums will attract many people from many different departments. And I'm really glad Tina's here, Tina De Silva from our grants management, and sort of thinking about this. Look, we can't any one of us individually change this, and it brings us back to the Trojan mouse, right? In that it's incremental change, small change over time. And so I think the one thing that the obligation I would say we have as investigators is to voice these challenges when they come up and raise them. And then, you know, if we don't have the solutions, bring them up to the departments and the leaders who can help us make solutions. So I just want to acknowledge Tina's presence and thank her for being here, because I know she's really interested in some of the change we're talking about.
Yes, thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you to all of you for this very powerful discussion. And as Tracy pointed out, you know, there's obviously, you know, many barriers within the infrastructure that we're all trying to work through, and you know, and some present greater challenges and it takes time, but I think we collectively also need to prioritize, you know, what we want to, you know, what we want to, where we want to see change, right? Because there's so much. And, you know, in my short time at BMC, you know, I have recognized, you know, the enormous change that we need to undertake, but we need to start scaling. And so, so I'm so happy to be here and to hear directly from you. And so continue to, you know, reach out to us and help us prioritize.
And I think also great points. I think that reaching out, right, that making connections. Before I came to BU, I worked in a much smaller system. Tufts is a smaller system than BU, and so when I ran into finance issues or questions, I knew the person to go to because there was one person in the department that I needed to go to at the time, and so it was very easy to navigate the system. But the bigger the system, the more challenging it is to be on the same page, to streamline. I wanted to point out to Keiku's question earlier, which I really appreciated, was I'll give you the macro social work approach to that question, right? There are different strategies that we could use when there's an issue we see or a change that needs to happen, right? That we could take a collaborative strategy, maybe community development approach, and I think we would think about, we would identify like other people who are impacted by the issue that we've identified. And as Tracy pointed out, we're coming together now to identify other researchers that may be impacted or folks who may be impacted by that issue. And we would think together about, well, where is the change? Who has control over, who has the power to make that change, right? Every system is made up of actors. Who's the actor who has the power to make that change? And then we would think about, well, will they be willing to work with us around that change? So we always want to start collaboratively, right? But then over time, it may be that we contest. We may have to organize. I think we saw a lot of this, not related to community engagement, but we definitely saw a lot of this around the pandemic, right? In different departments. Maybe it was letter writing, maybe it was, you know, flat out, no, we're not going in. But we think about, we would think collectively about our strategy, but we would never do it alone. We would come up, when we hit a hurdle, we never hit that hurdle alone. We identify who else is impacted, try to make, you know, alliances, relationships, and work together to think about how we're all impacted and what we'd all like to see in our system as opposed to that. And would it take time? Certainly it would. But there are small wins we would make along the way. So.
Yeah, that to me, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tina.
No, I wanted to thank Linda because I completely resonate with what you just said, you know, and that's exactly what I mean by priority, right? So, you know, we need to collectively work through some of these barriers and, you know, and make small changes that are meaningful.
Yeah, and you know, knowing who the players are and who the partners are and having a relationship with them is like, you can't do it unless that's in place. And I think that's where we, you know, especially with the pandemic, where we've really struggled with that. I think we've lost a lot of ground in those relationships. And that's what, again, what this kind of a forum is really meant to foster. I want to go back to a comment you made, Linda, around sort of time, you know, that takes time, and back to that sort of comment of, if we're talking about organizational design and structures, it's the, you know, the reward system. Like, what do we value? What does the organization value? Whether that be in the promotion process or the, you know, I'm thinking about my own self, and I'm not shy about saying that I've been here for 21 years and I'm still not a full professor. I have a lot of accomplishments. I've done some really, I think I'm proud of many of the things that I've accomplished, but I have spent a lot of time in relationships and sort of building these relations because that's what I value. But that's not the currency of our system. And so I think we need to be really thoughtful about organizational change to make sure we reward and value those types of activities, and taking the time should be rewarded and not penalized. And we have a long way to go in that regard. But one other area around sort of organizational structure that I want to make sure that I highlight is, because we're really proud of it, is our CAB, or Community Advisory Board for COVID Health Equity, that we launched last year. I think that there's a very sort of active interest in community advisory boards or councils to sort of support our work. And I think it's one of the most common consultations we get in our program, and our funders are expecting these kinds of governing sort of bodies and support systems for our work. And so I don't know if Rebecca or is Jen on, if you guys want to talk a little bit about the intentionality of the work that went into developing this CAB, and maybe give a little preview about what's coming with our health equity rubric that everyone can look forward to seeing from our group.
Rebecca, do you want to kick off, or should I?
It'd be great if you get us started, Jen.
Definitely. So our health equity and COVID research CAB started we're coming up on a year, and we were very sort of intentional, and Rebecca was sort of spearheading this process, very intentional with sort of identifying community members who really had a stake in the community and were really interested in the idea of equity and improving research. And so over time, we've met with them monthly. And we initially sort of convened them to sort of support the review of research. So researchers at BMC and BU had indicated that they want more feedback from the community about how well they're incorporating equity into their work. And so we assembled this CAB to sort of help with that endeavor. Over time, the CAB found that they wanted to have a more sort of structured way that they were contributing to sort of how we reviewed research proposals from the BMC and BU community, and decided to focus on the development of this health equity in research rubric. And so the equity in research rubric we've been developing it since sort of early 2022, like even sort of before I started. And we convened these smaller work groups, which is a small subgroup of the Community Advisory Board that really focused on the overall development, but while still keeping the Community Advisory Board intertwined in that development process. Fast forward to today, we're really excited. We've been able to finally sort of share a couple versions of the equity rubric with researchers to get just some preliminary bits of feedback about sort of how efficient the tool is for this purpose. And we're really excited that next month, we plan to be launching that rubric. And I want to sort of tap on Rebecca, because she has been so sort of instrumental in helping us get that rubric out the door, and we're getting so close. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. As Jen described, this was a great opportunity for us to support community members' ideas about research in BMC and Boston University. And this rubric is a tool that will make that happen. And to support that process, we have been talking with different leaders within BMC. We've been working very closely with the Clinical Research Network. In fact, the Clinical Research Network is a partner in this process. In their role, they support researchers to carry out clinical studies. And so to have them at the table early in this process helps us identify ways that we can promote use of these ideas about equity in research that come from the voice of community members. We're also working with the leadership in the Health Equity Accelerator. As you know, research is an important goal of the Health Equity Accelerator. So how can we integrate the work the CAB is doing in these structures that support the research process? So more to come on this, and I hope everyone who is a researcher here reaches out to us to potentially talk with the CAB about their project, because the CAB is there also to provide guidance on specific studies and work with researchers.
Thanks, Jen and Rebecca. It's really exciting. Very excited to see the final product. And it's going to be an iterative process, right? We're going to sort of launch it and sort of see how it goes, but it's meant to be a tool to support all of us in our work. So I see we're getting at the top of the hour, and we want to maybe take a minute to sort of just summarize the discussion a little bit. Linda, do you want to take a stab at it? Do you want me to take a stab at it?
Sure. Structural change, revolution. No, I'm just kidding. So no, I mean, I think that one of the things that we've really talked about related to creating a culture of community engagement and moving incremental change within our structure is intentionality. We have to be intentional. We have to kind of have the difficult conversations and be willing to learn and grow. And I think that that can be hard when we start to have some of these conversations, because change is hard, you know, it's uncomfortable. We're having conversations that as a society we don't really like to have. But the reality is, when we think about barriers to translational science, the same barriers that we experience related to workforce diversity, the same barriers that we experience related to retention, pipeline program barriers, all of those, and the community engagement barriers, those are all rooted in the same I don't want to say evil, but the same thing, right? Is that our system is not designed for everyone. It never was. And until we redesign it, it's not going to be. And so we really have to start to come together, have these conversations and work collaboratively, or we're not going to get there. Like none of us are going to get there alone. We're just going to keep on spinning our wheels and recreating the same system. And the burden of labor, emotional labor, stress will be disproportionately balanced within the system, and we'll keep on having to develop new programs to engage new populations. You know, it's the similar when we think about, I was talking to someone, I have finished a community health worker grant a little while back, and we talk about, you know, why do we need a community health worker workforce? Because other workforces like social work continue to professionalize. And so a lot of those job categories that were left because people are trying to professionalize, you know, because of the inequities within our system and the hierarchy, as people try to reach the top of the hierarchy, it leaves gaps in the bottom. And so then we have to bring in a new workforce, community health workers. But if we just valued the skills and expertise that each of us brings, and we did that in an equitable way, instead of trying to create a hierarchy, we'd get a lot further. So I think that I didn't do a good job of summary. I opened more windows and more lines. And sorry.
Set us up for our next speaker series, Dima.
I did. Yeah.
So Dima's going to throw up our next monthly speaker series, which is focused on equity, engagement, and vaccines. So we're really excited about our speakers for that session. We're going to continue the spirit of this dialogue at that meeting.
And just to preview, I was just going to say, for preview for that session, very exciting. We have folks who were funded originally by CTSI pilots talking about their work in BMC. We have some folks from the Brazilian Worker Center who are going to be coming to talk about a vaccine initiative that they did during the pandemic. We're really excited about our next speaker series. So turn it back to Tracy.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for sticking with us. We're going to transition and stay on for another 30 minutes for those of you who'd like to stay on for a networking session. We don't have a real full agenda for that. It's really just meant to be a space for us to debrief on our conversation or engage in dialogue and any topic of interest for all of you And it's really in the spirit of creating space for these community relationships to build. And so I just want to, on behalf of the whole CE program, thank you for participating. Thank you, Dima, for a run of show, Jennifer and Rebecca for supporting us, and Linda, you're a great co-host.